Can you hear you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Good
Can you all hear
morning.
me? We weren't sure how we were going to do this morning because we have one of these, but the wonderful Heath and Fox assist us in how to do this. We preach together. My name's Ann Deneen. This is Reverend Joe Duggan. And I'm a retired Lutheran pastor. He's a retired Episcopal priest. But we've been preaching together. And this morning, we'll start with, we're just going to kind of go through each of the lessons with you, starting with the passage from Deuteronomy, which appropriately reminds us to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. And to set the stage for this, we're in this second Sunday after Trinity, so we've been moving through the trajectory of Lent and Eastertide. And now we're back in the life of Jesus. And I would say it's a little sudden. You're just sort of planted right back in the midst of what's happening. But we start with this beautiful consideration of what the Sabbath is in Deuteronomy. And I'd like you to just invite you into a minute to that particular way of speaking of that commandment, of the Sabbath commandment, reminds the Israelites not so much of the Sabbath in creation, although it's present. We know that on the seventh day, God rested. So it's built into the architecture of our way of observing time if we're in the biblical faith. We observe time in a particular way. There's Abraham Heschel calls it a cathedral in time, not a cathedral, an architecture of time. So in the center of time, as in this biblical way of thinking about it, it's the Sabbath, and everything radiates from that. So in this passage in Deuteronomy, what the writer wants us to remember is the Sabbath is also linked to the freedom of being led out of Egypt, being led out of slavery into freedom. And it becomes a guiding principle in that particular way of speaking of Sabbath to not only do we rest, but everyone related to our lives rests. The creation rests. The slaves rest. The animals rest. Everything rests. And in that, it affirms that this rest is a holy gift. So the person who is resting, and you notice in there the language of slavery still exists, your male and female slaves also rest. Everything rests. No one works. It's this moment of stepping back into the holiness and the sanctity of a day of rest, which is still observed very beautifully in Jewish families and Jewish households, marking Friday night to Saturday night. So there's a kind of ritual about that we do. And then we have our Sabbath on Sunday. We have our observation on Sunday, but we live in a world that pays no attention to that. So part of the responsibility that we carry is remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy from inside and creating that structure in some way in a world that doesn't want to let anyone rest. So I'll say more about that a little later.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, setting up, bringing us back through history and also the Jewish people and from Friday to Saturday night. When we do this kind of preaching, we come to churches and congregations, we always know what we're going to say, but it's always slightly shifted by walking around the church in which we're occupying. And this morning was no different for us and for me, being here at St. Francis and seeing all the iconography and imagery of St. Francis. And I think it's important early on in the sermon to talk about Francis, because Francis has such an amazing capacity to sit. I love the sitting. I love the sitting Francis in the back with his hands open and the shelling. And what a wonderful setting this is to drive up to this church, to be surrounded by nature and trees and birds and flowers. It's truly a celebration who Francis is and was. And we learn from Francis in how to encounter this text. I love the readings that really flow through this whole sense of Sabbath. And Sabbath at one point was keeping holy the Sabbath, the day. And we've actually grown into an expansion of Sabbath to take Sabbath time in our week, Sabbath moments. And I think Francis is a great model for us of how to be in the presence of Sabbath at all times, not just on Sunday.
It was present to him,
Yeah.
so much so. One of the things I love about the statue out there is there's one in Assisi where Francis is sitting on the side of the hill looking out over the city, and he's at complete rest. And what we loved about Francis is that somehow in his experience of the divine, he was able to sense that he was so connected to the earth and to the bodily earth, and that Sabbath is, and that peacefulness is a part of that. One of the ways I have experienced Sabbath is on silent retreat, which is actually a form of kind of structured rest. And what I noticed about being in that, as participating in silent retreat, but also in leading them, is that when you take time to just not talk, as I'm talking this morning, when you take time just to be quiet, with a group of people, a kind of peace rises that is effortless. And that's a kind of Sabbath peace. I think Francis was in touch with that kind of peace that just rises from being. One of the gifts of being here is you're surrounded by that kind of peace, in the summer at least. The other thing we wanted to connect to Sabbath was the psalm this morning. As you're reading through, the psalmist has such an awareness of the presence of God, of the intimacy of God's presence within the psalmist and all around the psalmist.
You know, I would say that one of the, if we go back to this statue in the back, this figure of Francis, one of the ways that Francis can sit there with open hands is because of the psalm, that God knows Francis and God knows each of us so deeply and so well. The psalm, I know you in your resting places. God knows Francis in his resting place, right? And none of us go to rest without all the life struggles and troubles that we have. And I love that epistle with the confidence that nothing will crush us. Francis can sit there because he's absolutely convinced that nothing can crush him. He can be so present to the birds and the flowers because he's known. To be known that deeply allows Francis to open his hands and allows us to open our hands.
Yeah, that's for all of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we wanted to bring this forward now to the gospel. And in that gospel, the presence of Jesus is, for us, the presence of God. And bringing in that expansive, beautiful way of thinking of Sabbath and the wide open kind of awareness of God in all moments. There's a moment when the disciples are picking grain off of the things that are growing around them to eat. So there's a kind of beautiful gesture of reaching out for what is needed, of reaching out for food. And then, did you want to speak about that?
Go ahead.
Keep going. I'll keep going. and then the second part of the gospel is another very beautiful gesture from Jesus, who says, reach out your hand. And, I think about what it's like to be asked to do that, and to know there must have been hesitation, there must have been fear, perhaps, maybe not. I have a hard time reaching out myself, as many of us do, and just the idea of reaching out to receive something, that is part of the gesture of Sabbath, that God offers this incredible, magnificent creation, these times of rest, this beautiful structure of rest, and just offers it. And can I reach to receive it.
We're both retired, and it's very, I think it's easy to be retired and discover Sabbath.
And I have the habit of work, so we're here.
She feels. But I love this image on your program this morning, on your order of worship, because I think Francis, sitting in nature, learns from the trees. And so I like to think of the flower bending towards, and the trees bending towards us and bending back. And this movement of coming and going and blending, almost the flowers and the trees genuflecting to creation, right?
Yeah.
And Francis learns from that.
Well, and one of the things that Francis taught is, it's said that he said this, we don't know if he actually said it, but he said, preach the word always, if necessary, use words. And so that's very Franciscan, that there's gospel actions that we take. Just as Jesus took the gospel action of healing, there's gospel actions we take as a people. But if you just think about that gesture for a minute, maybe take this with you through the week. Just the offering and the receiving. The offering and the receiving and the reaching out of one's hand. I just love that as a position that we take in the world with others, of reaching for, for receiving back, or reaching for what we need and having the courage to receive it back. It's just a very beautiful passage. And there's kind of when you were saying this, I was thinking about the breath that moves through creation. Every breath we take is truly the gift.
There's one more piece. There's one more piece that we're forgetting, that was your insight all throughout our preparations, which I'll give you the key words and then you go right with it. The differentiation between Sabbath as the final day of the creation and liberation, and then the Sabbath as a part of justice.
Right. So thank you for that. So Walter Brueggemann has a beautiful book called The Sabbath as Resistance. And part of practicing Sabbath, which is so countercultural, and it's in that Deuteronomy passage, it's in the Psalm, it's in Paul, it's in the Gospel. Part of practicing Sabbath is when you practice this moment, you begin to see the structures that keep us away and working and struggling. And it's a moment of understanding that when you allow everything to rest, wonderful things happen. And I'll bring you back to the pandemic for that for a minute. As hard as it was for the world to stop what it was doing for the safety of others, and as painful and terrible as all that grief was, something really interesting happened to the planet. And it made the news that waters began to clear up, that skies changed, that there was animals did things differently, and that our resting out of fear, because we had to, created a whole different way of being in the world for the world's sake. And I think that if you're interested in caring for creation, which I know this congregation is, and of course that's one of Francis's great commitments, you'll see that resting not only benefits us, but it reveals to us the structures that harm us, and it gives creation a rest from all of our toil. It's a powerful teaching, both a necessity and then also something we can do for the sake of the world.
It's a paradigm change, because there's a tendency to think of Sabbath as not doing, as Sabbath as stopping work, which it is, but of not doing and of not being productive. But in actuality,
it frees us up.
We need to stop in order to see that we may engage. So truly, a justice action is to take Sabbath, to step back. As God steps back and sees us, we're really kind of following that model in Psalm 139, to see the world as God sees us.